A continuació, veureu l'entrevista que li vaig fer a la Emily Lakdawalla. Ella és una gran especialista en l'exploració del Sistema Solar, ha escrit molts llibres, també va estar treballant durant anys amb la Planetary Society dels Estats Units, amb la qual és una de les persones de referència quan es parla de l'exploració, sobretot de Mart i dels rovers marcians, dels robots marcians. Ens explicarà molts detalls, alguns dels quals arribarà a un nivell de profunditat, com veureu, tècnic bastant interessant. Espero que us agradi l'entrevista. Vaig tenir sort, molta sort, de que em pogués atendre uns dies abans de que el Perseverance arribés a Mart. Ja sabeu, si us agraden els continguts del canal, us podeu subscriure i em podeu seguir per xarxes socials sota el nom Estels i Planetes. Why is landing on Mars so difficult?
So it is uniquely difficult because Mars has just enough atmosphere to be a problem, but not enough to slow you all the way down. So it combines the challenges of landing on the moon and Earth. On the moon, you have no atmosphere, so you have to use rockets to slow down and bring yourself to a landing. On Earth, you have thick atmosphere, so you have to worry about heating by friction as you enter. But the atmosphere allows you to use a heat shield and a parachute to slow down to a safe landing speed. At Mars, you need both. You have a supersonic entry, you have potentially catastrophic heating, you light up like a comet or like an asteroid entering the atmosphere. But by the time you've slowed down with your heat shield and your parachute, you're still going far too fast to land safely. So then you also need rockets. And the challenge with both Curiosity and now Perseverance is that the spacecraft is so heavy that to put a lander underneath it, to land it on a landing platform, adds far too much weight. And so they had to develop this other method where the rover's running gear, its wheels, is also its landing gear. And as an engineering problem, that's very difficult. And the way that they help to solve this problem is by separating the rockets from the landing gear, which is why they deploy the rover on a string, so that you have the rocket doing its own thing, and you have the landing gear doing their own thing and interacting with the surface, and they're decoupled physically. So I think a lot of people first look at the landing mechanism and think that is crazy. Who came up with this Rube Goldberg idea? But it's actually because it separates some of the very difficult challenges of landing into two separate problems that the engineers can design for and model as their own problems, rather than having them all in one giant problem. So that's why it's so complicated and difficult.
Complicated and difficult with a crane, but with the Pathfinder or Spirit or Opportunity was even crazier.
Yeah, it does seem, in retrospect, bouncing a nearly billion-dollar spacecraft off the surface of a planet does not seem like a very wise way to land. And it's certainly, more importantly, it's no way to land astronauts. So you have to come up with a better method if you're ever going to put humans on the surface. And so what Curiosity and Perseverance are doing, I was looking at, there was a press briefing today, and they shared a picture that really had the back shell with a worker side by side. So you really had the correct perspective. And that shell, it is clearly big enough. I mean, it is much bigger than Gemini. It's like as big as an Apollo reentry capsule. It is a large capsule. And so it's not as big as something you would want to actually fly to Mars in, for sure. It's way too small for that. But we are beginning to get to the human scale of landing at least astronauts, if not all the habitat and everything they need on Mars.
What amazes you the most about the 7 minutes of terror? All the thing coming down from the space at high speed and then entering the atmosphere and descending. What amazes you most about this?
Well, they've made two refinements to the way that that we land things on Mars since Pathfinder. So everything before Curiosity, you did everything you could in space with rockets. You aimed your spacecraft at Mars, but then the descent and landing was ballistic. That is, it fell, and wherever it fell is where it landed. And so as a result, the landing ellipse, the area in which you might possibly land, was very large because Mars's atmosphere, just like Earth, has variations. It might be taller or smaller on any given day because of solar activity and weather and things you can't predict ahead of time. But Curiosity added one big innovation, and that was something called guided entry, where the spacecraft has knowledge of where it is and where it's supposed to end up, and actually steers. It flies as opposed to just falling through the Martian atmosphere. Now, it is still mostly falling. I don't know if people are familiar with the movie Toy Story, but the character Buzz Lightyear says, no, actually it's the main character. His name is escaping me right now, but he says, "You're not flying, you're falling with style." And that's basically what they're doing. They're falling with style, but they are turning and steering as they go in order to try to aim at a specific landing spot. And that enabled them to shrink the landing ellipse a lot for Curiosity. And now with Perseverance, they're adding two more upgrades to the landing technology. One is very simple. It's called range trigger. And what range trigger is that it's when they deploy the parachute. In all previous missions, they have used velocity as the trigger for when to deploy the parachute. So when the velocity reaches a certain speed, when it goes below a certain speed that the parachute will survive deploying, then they go ahead and deploy the parachute because, and the reason for that is you want to use as much of the atmosphere to slow down as you possibly can. It helps you, gives you, it's a little less risky to use as much of the atmosphere as you have available. But it turns out that now that we have the ability to guide the entry more carefully, you don't really need that extra tiny bit of safety that the very extra tiny bit of atmosphere gives you. Instead, it's much better to use a range trigger, that is to use the spacecraft's position to tell you when to deploy the parachute, because then you can more accurately target the safest part of your landing ellipse. And so that is a change they made between Curiosity and Perseverance, that they're going to pick where they deploy the parachute based on where the spacecraft actually is with respect to its landing point. So that improves precision. They said on today's press briefing, it shrinks the landing ellipse area by a factor of 10. So it shrinks the dimension by a factor of about 3. And then finally, they're using something called terrain relative navigation, which is where they have a high-speed camera on board the spacecraft that takes a couple of photos of the land below the spacecraft once it's reached a certain altitude. And then the rover has on board maps that humans have made of the landing ellipse and all of the hazards that we want the rover to avoid. Every boulder, every large crater, every dune field, and the rover will compare the photo that it takes to the map, identify precisely where it is, and then figure out how to steer to one of the safe spots that's already been identified within the landing zone. And if that works exactly as it's supposed to, we are going to get to a spot that permits the rover to really hit the ground running and to get going. As soon as they've done all the critical deployments in the first week or so, they'll be off like a shot on their driving mission to get to where they need to go to do great science. And so that not only improves the, it not only reduces the risk of the landing, but it will improve the initial quality of the mission by just getting it started faster.
And talking about science, what are your expectations about Perseverance?
So Perseverance is not really a standalone mission. It is a mission that is going to collect samples. And then most of the science that it's going to do while on the ground is in support of sample collection. So instead of focusing on making discoveries on Mars, it's about selecting samples to return from Mars and getting all of the documentary information about those samples that is necessary to interpret it properly once we get them back on Earth. So although there will be interesting results coming out of Perseverance about what the environment was like when this river delta formed in the crater, you know, maybe some other stuff like that, it won't be a lot different from Curiosity. And in fact, the science capability of the rover is less than that of Curiosity, because it does not have the onboard laboratory instruments that Curiosity had. It doesn't have the SAM gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. It doesn't have the ChemIn X-ray diffraction instrument for the mineralogical analysis. So the science it can do on the ground is actually not as sophisticated as what Curiosity could do. They replaced those laboratory instruments with the sample collection mechanisms. And so it'll be fun to follow. It'll be a great road trip. There will be really beautiful pictures to see and kind of fun science along the way, weather stuff to report, interesting technology demonstrations. The helicopter is going to be huge fun. But I think people should keep their expectations low about the science results until we get samples back to Earth. Even if they did see something that looked like a dinosaur bone, and there are people all over the internet who will tell you that Curiosity has found dinosaur bones on Mars, but no, they did not. No scientist would ever say, yes, life has definitely been discovered on Mars, until we get those samples back in the laboratory and can verify. Because not only is it about having a better laboratory on Earth, it's about having many scientific teams on Earth who are all in competition with each other, who all have different instruments, different ways of investigation. Those kinds of things have to be confirmed by lots of different people using lots of different methods for us to be really sure about what the rover discovers. And so we have to be patient. We have to wait for NASA and the European Space Agency, who's going to play a very important role in the next steps of sample return to get those missions developed and flown.
And what information do you have about this future mission between NASA and the European Space Agency?
So NASA and ESA have recently signed an agreement that basically lays out a framework for the future of sample return. There are two big missions that need to happen. One will put a lander on Mars that has a small rover called a fetch rover, which ESA will build. So NASA builds a lander because NASA is the one with the real expertise in landing precisely on Mars. ESA, by then, should have demonstrated the ExoMars rover on the surface and demonstrated rover operational ability. So ESA will provide the rover that will follow in Perseverance's footsteps, pick up the samples, and bring them back to the lander, place them into a small rocket, place them into a sample container. The lander will put them into a small rocket that then launches the sample canister into Mars orbit. And that's the end of the second mission. The third mission, which will actually launch at about the same time the second mission does, will consist of a European-built spacecraft that will be ion-powered, because ESA has a lot of experience in building long-duration ion-powered spacecraft. That's what Rosetta was. That will fly to Mars, go into orbit, place a retrieval module into Mars orbit that will pick up that sample canister, bring it back to the orbiter, and then ESA, with its ion-powered spacecraft, will actually be able to leave Mars with it and come back to Earth. And so NASA will build the sample retrieval thing that separates from the orbiter, finds this tiny capsule in Mars orbit, grabs it, brings it back to the orbiter, and then ESA will fly it home.
Wow.
And so it's a wonderful partnership. It's very challenging. It's great drama. It's going to be expensive, but I think it's an inspiring challenge for NASA and ESA to work on together, in deep space to get this sample return mission done. And then once the samples arrive back on Earth, it will, most of them will be curated in a NASA laboratory at Johnson Space Center, which after all has experience since Apollo of handling return samples. But just like every other, as with Apollo and everything else, those samples will be distributed to hundreds of laboratories. They'll be cut up and powdered and made thin sections and every kind of different preparation you can imagine. Some of them will be reserved for future analysis. They'll be kept, very cold, in vacuum, safe, and others will be distributed to hundreds of laboratories around the world to analyze and to ask scientific questions of. It's going to be great.
Yeah. By when? By when will we see this future mission?
I forget the exact timeline. There's a real good graphic on ESA's website, but we're talking, I think, at least mid-2030s before the samples get back to Earth, I think.
Okay.
And it all depends on budgets. It depends on how much NASA and ESA are both allocated to do all the necessary steps. I do think, though, if I recall correctly, that there's a bit of a time limit in that there are 2 especially good Mars launch opportunities coming up in the late 2020s, where Earth and Mars are especially favorably aligned so that it takes less energy, less fuel to get to Mars and to come back. And so I think they're really working toward these launches in the late 2020s. So they'll target, I think, you'll have to verify these numbers for me, but they'll target 2027. If things get delayed, there's another opportunity in 2029 in order to try to get the best opportunity to get these spacecraft to Mars.
Okay. Let's don't forget Curiosity. How is she aging? I mean, is she old?
So yes, but really the rover's activities are limited by budget. They could do more than they're doing with Curiosity if it were not for reduced funds available to do daily operations. Now, Curiosity is beginning to get old enough that actually age is catching up with the reduced budget, in that the nuclear power source that has allowed Curiosity to last so long also gets weaker over time, because after all, it's powered by the decay of the radioisotope power source. And so as that decays, the rover energy source puts out less power over time. It takes longer to recharge the batteries. So all the rovers on Mars have always operated off of batteries. They can maybe be awake for about 5 hours of the day, and they sleep the rest of the time, recharging their batteries. And so now it takes longer to accumulate a charge. The rover can do some things without much energy, like take photos, take weather data, that kind of thing. But driving and arm activities take a lot of energy. So as time goes on, we'll see the rover driving shorter distances and using the arm less frequently, just because it has to sit and recharge for longer between the times that it does those activities. And so the pace of the mission is going to get slower and slower and slower, but it's really mostly just the energy that is causing this. It's not really any other problems. The wheels made a lot of news early in the mission because they got a lot of holes in them, but after testing on Earth, they learned how to baby the wheels and to protect them. And so although they've continued to suffer damage, it's been nothing like the pace at which they got damaged earlier. And now they project that the wheels will be perfectly fine as long as the rover's energy lasts. So the wheels are no longer a concern. They have to be careful about how they drive, but now that's just baked into their process. So it's really, even all of the instruments are working great. There's one, the Russian neutron instrument was supposed to, it requires this helium, this pressurized helium source. And it was expected to lose vacuum after a while, just because there's only so long you can hold a vacuum. And helium is such a tiny atom, it would just eventually leak out. It's what happens to a helium balloon. And you can spend $1 million building a better balloon, but ultimately it's still a balloon and it's going to develop fractures and the helium's going to leak out. It was supposed to happen like 2 years after the mission started, and it's still working. So, I mean, everything's really working pretty great. There's little aging bits and pieces, but it's actually doing a lot better than either of the previous Spirit and Opportunity we're doing at this point, which, I mean, it should be, because those were designed to last 3 months each, not 2 years each. But it is doing fine. It's very healthy, just a little slower and creakier than it used to be.
Perfect. What would you answer to people asking, why are we spending so much money on Mars while we have here people starving, or we have other problems on Earth, and we are spending money on Mars?
Yeah, it's a common question. It's a good question that people who do this kind of thing need to answer and justify why it is important to have this as a priority. I have a few different answers for that. One of them is to point out that the money, after all, is not put into a rocket and launched to Mars. It's invested here on Earth, and a lot of the investment is into developing new technologies that actually then benefit humans in other ways. So, for instance, the autonomous driving technologies that have been developed for rovers on Earth are now being used in the kinds of robots that go into earthquake-damaged buildings and look for the heat signatures of living people trapped inside. Things like a lot of the image processing technology that's been developed for spacecraft are now used in medical imaging. And NASA has a whole website devoted to this called NASA Spin-Offs, where you can see how technologies developed through taxpayer investment into NASA engineering have gone on to be used by private companies and public companies to benefit humans in other ways. So it's a lot of money for each mission. $2.5 billion is nothing to sneeze at, but it's spent over many years, and it's kind of like when you have a personal investment portfolio, you always put some of it in very safe things, but you always should put a little tiny bit of it in something risky that, it's okay if you lose that, but if it pays off big. And that's kind of, that's a lot of how these sort of investments work. The other thing that we're investing in with these kinds of missions is inspiration. And so, there are kids around the world, space and dinosaurs, they're just passionate about space and dinosaurs. And every kid who wants to be an astronaut or a rover driver is not going to grow up to be an astronaut or a rover driver, but they will grow up with an interest in science and technology and engineering. And that will inspire them to pursue those kinds of studies. And as they get older, they'll think, well, maybe I don't want to fly in a spaceship, but I would love to work on designing spacecraft, or I would like to work on designing things to make humans' lives better. And so that inspiration that we spend to get people realizing how exciting science and engineering can be, how creative it is, how you use it to solve problems and to do difficult things that nobody's ever done before, is a way to get more people involved in scientific exploration. And we haven't talked about the other missions that recently arrived at Mars, but the United Arab Emirates mission, which just went into orbit, named Hope, they're very explicit about the reason they are doing that mission. It is all about inspiring their country's youth to envision a future that is not just about oil, but that is instead about discovery, developing new technologies, solving problems, engineering challenge. They're trying to transform their country from a backward-looking one, depending on sucking, unrenewable resources out of the ground, to a forward-looking one based on technology. And they also have a big demographic problem. They have a large proportion of their population is very young, and there's a lot of, as there has been throughout the Arab world, there's a lot of discontent with how things are going, and they want to say, look, here is a hopeful future that you can aspire to, and by doing that, you can make our country a better and more forward-looking place. And that has been an explicit message of that mission, both to young men and women. And in fact, 85% of their science team is women. And so that's been a fantastic thing. NASA doesn't, it's not as big a priority for NASA, but it is still a very big priority for NASA. Most of the briefings they're doing this week were actually geared towards school children. They have a lot of live stream for school children of different ages to try to get kids inspired to do science and exploration.
If you had the chance, would you go to Mars?
Absolutely not. I am so happy that there are robots that can go to all these uncomfortable places for me and send me back pictures. To go to Mars, I'd have to pick Mars over everything else that I can do with my life. But to send robots, I can go to every planet in the solar system, and I can sit at home and drink my wine and enjoy my good food and my comfortable bed. And meanwhile, I'm exploring the entire solar system through robot eyes. So more power to the people who want that adventure and to be the person who sets foot where nobody has before. I will be glad to do everything I can to survey the landscape first and to give you all the information you need to get there. But I'm quite happy in my comfortable home. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Earth is my favorite planet, really. I mean, it's so beautiful. There's so many things to see and do here. I would have a hard time leaving that behind.
It is beautiful, yes. Do you think that we may contaminate Mars? NASA have protocols to prevent going with microbes to Mars, but do you think that there is a chance that we can contaminate these worlds that we are exploring?
Definitely. And so, although I've talked about human exploration before, I'm actually against accelerating human exploration to Mars for that very reason. Because Mars is, after all, a place where there could be past life and even extant life. And I think until we've really investigated that thoroughly and either discovered it and know how to protect it, or determined that we've looked really hard and there's no sign, I think that the more conservative and moral, ethical approach is to avoid putting any Earth life forms on the surface as much as possible. Now, we can still do human exploration of Mars. A way that we can use human brains and hands and dexterity, both of mind and body, and still keep Mars a lot safer is if you place humans in orbit around Mars and have them teleoperating robots on the surface, much as surgeons on Earth may teleoperate across the world. You still get all the skill and the mind of the human, but you just don't put those microbes down on the surface. And so for me, that is the way that I think that's where human technology development is going anyway. I think, the world is something, especially this year, is getting to be a scarier place to be outside. And after all, space is a very dangerous place. So why not, make robots that handle all of the danger and keep the humans in a safer location where they can be comfortable, where they don't have to spend so much time dealing with the environmental challenges of surviving on a surface. So keep them in an orbiting station, keep them in a base you build on Phobos, which certainly does not have life on it, and then operate robots on the surface.
My last question was about yourself, to inspire young people who are asking, what can I study to be involved in the space exploration? What would you say to those young people?
It takes all kinds to explore space. Obviously, engineers and scientists are at the top of the list. So those are two big paths, is aerospace engineering, which can be either mechanical or, coding. I forget the word, but whatever that is. And then in science, the two main approaches to doing things in space are astronomy and geology. Geology is always good because it's good to have boots on the ground on Earth and understand how things work on Earth before you go to studying things in space. Astronomy and physics are good because it enables you to really handle big data sets and to understand how to pull together. You understand the statistics a lot better. It's also, by the way, very marketable, apparently, outside of astronomy. Apparently, an astronomy degree, the kinds of things you learn doing that, make you very useful in other contexts. So that's cool, too. But space also needs communicators, managers, writers, artists. It needs all kinds. And so the advice that I always give to kids is not to specialize too early, to keep yourself well-rounded, because you, after all, cannot predict the future. And so, and especially for science kids who, and math kids who may do those things to the exclusion of other kinds of study, I'm sorry, but it really is important to be able to write and communicate well. Because if you can't write well, you won't get your grants, you won't be able to communicate your findings to your superiors. When it comes to managing, you have to have all those interpersonal skills. So if you like to write, by all means, do your science course and also study the humanities, study history, study management, study literature. Anything that helps you analyze texts will also make you a better scientist and a better communicator. So basically, I guess it's just follow what you love and keep your options open. Do not specialize too early.
Wonderful.
Or if you do specialize, make sure that you dabble in other things enough to remain a well-rounded person who can move about as needs of society change.
Wonderful. That's it, Emily. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time and information. Thank you very much, Emily.
Okay, you're welcome.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.